Remember the people in the story that got called to Chicago? Mama had another idea, however. She didn't want to leave her prized possession, the lovely red linoleum for which she had paid, and then she had paid the then whopping sum of $1. Can you imagine? Linoleum or kitchen floor for $1. Papa said, we must pray. Mama said, I will put out the fleece. If someone comes to buy this without a sign, and then offers $1 for the linoleum, then I will know God has spoken. So they prayed. Papa was sure God would set Mama straight. Mama was sure nobody would ever offer to buy a house with no for sale sign. Both believed that God would hear and answer their prayer. Both believed in God's faithfulness. If you want to take a step of faith, then you need to obey God's call. However, but there is more. If you take a step of faith, like Sarah, and believe God's promise, you have to remember that these people were not teenagers starting out their life together. When the promise came in Genesis 12, Abraham was 75 years old. The promise didn't come to fruition until he was 100 years old. And Sarah was 90. Now this might not be politically correct, but that's old. As someone put it, it's chronologically challenged. At a time when they must have been thinking about dying, they became parents. You have to consider that they had doubts along the way. After all, 25 years is a long time to wait. Perhaps they thought, maybe God forgot. Maybe God was just joking. Maybe God isn't able to do it after all. Maybe God changed his mind. Maybe we ought to fulfill the promise ourselves. Here's Hagar, very child by her. And you know, Ishmael was born when Abraham was 86 years old. But doubts notwithstanding, the text said, by faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. God always performs his promises. He's never late, he's never early, he's always right on time. His is the promise, ours is to believe. His is to perform, ours is to patiently wait. God's promises are far too numerous and varied to list here. We were talking about this earlier in the elders meeting, and it's amazing how sometimes that happens. That's the way it happens. Sometimes we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know when God's going to answer our prayer. We don't know how God's going to answer our prayer. And sometimes we feel like we've just been waiting forever. And then sometimes when God finally does answer the prayer, it's kind of like, oh my goodness, this goes so fast. I mean, I was a little surprised. I'm very excited, but when after we called Scott and told him, and then it's like they're going to be here on the 13th or 15th. I said, wow, you know, that was faster than I expected, and I'm excited about that because, like I said, you know, God's timing is God's, and the process seemed to take a long time, but it happened. God keeps his promises. He's promised to provide for all our needs. Not all our wants, but all our needs. He's promised to be with us in and through all things. He promised to limit the temptations and trials we suffer. I know sometimes we think, really? But he did promise that. He's promised to give us life that is abundant and rich. He's promised mercy to spare us the punishment we do deserve, and grace to give us the forgiveness that we do not deserve. He promised to take us to heaven with him, where he's prepared a place for us. God kept his promise, and as a result of their faith, Isaac was born in their old age. They believed God's promise because they believed God. Well, Papa and Mama believed God too. Papa believed that God would set Mama straight on Chicago. Mama believed that God would never ask her to give up her prized possession. Sometimes what we believe about God and what he will or won't do is way different, right? Sometimes he does ask us to yield our most prized possessions. One day a lady stopped to talk to Mama as she worked in her garden. She commented that she was looking for a little house just like this one. Would you be interested in selling it? Mama's first reaction was, oh no. Then she remembered her fleece and invited the lady in for coffee. The lady quickly noted and commented upon the red linoleum. Mama told her she had paid a whole $1 for it. The woman, needless to say, bought the house and paid $1 more for the linoleum. Mama gave up her prized possession. Abraham, too, was confronted with a challenge to surrender that which was most precious to him. God spoke and he said, "Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you." What a demand. Understand, God didn't want Abraham to actually offer his son as a burnt offering. But he did want Abraham to face and pass that test. That's another step of faith that we all need to take. Like Abraham, sacrifice your most precious. Abraham went to Moriah as directed and was fully prepared to sacrifice his favorite son. Think of the faith that would require. Would you be willing to offer your child that way? Think about the cost. If he offered Isaac on the altar, where would the promise of becoming a great nation? Remember that Abraham was to become a mighty nation through Isaac. If he offered Isaac, his heart would surely break. How could he give up his precious son? But he was willing to offer his most precious because, you see, Abraham was absolutely convinced that God knew what he was doing. It reminds me of a little boy, a story of a little boy. His older brothers and sisters were cringing under the bed during a lightning and thunderstorm. He peered under there and said, "Quit your bawling. Don't you expect God knows what he's doing?" Abraham expected God knew what he was doing. God is too wise to make a mistake, too loving to be cruel, too faithful to lie, and too powerful to fail. God could raise Isaac from the dead if he did sacrifice him. Verse 19, he considered that God is able to raise men even from the dead, for which he also received him back as a type. God asks us to give our best, that which is most precious. So what will you lay on the altar of sacrifice? See, one of the things about trusting God is that sometimes he might want us to give something precious, something that we don't want to give up. You know, it's like this one friend of mine said, I had a bunch of comic books. He had a comic book collection. And so he said, I can get rid of some of these. And so he picked out the ones that were torn or the ones that he'd read many times. But he had one stack that he wasn't going to give up. You see, all of us can do that. There's things that we can get rid of in our life that I won't miss that. I can give that away. But that's not what we're talking about. Sometimes we might need to give to God something that we hold very precious and very dear. But the point is, when people do that, God does sometimes very amazing things. Papa wanted very much to go to Chicago. He wanted to do what he thought God was calling him to do. Mama didn't want to go, but was willing if God would tell her so. She yielded her will to his and sold the house. She said, when God has spoken, don't look back. Little did she know that when she left, that red linoleum, she'd soon have wall-to-wall carpet. Little did she realize she was leaving a house on the prairie for a finer one in the city. She learned, as we all will, that when we yield our prized possessions to him, he more than restores them. When we yield our life to him, he gives back richer, fuller, and freer than it ever was before. He gives it back freer and fuller than it ever was before. Remember the story of Job? Horrible stuff he went through. But God gave him back richer and fuller than it was before. When we surrender to God, when we trust the God who created the universe, who says he wants to have a relationship with, who adopts us as his children, and we surrender to him and we give ourselves to him in total surrender, total abandonment, he'll make us fuller and richer than we ever were before. I'm excited about what God could be doing for our church. I believe that God has been working in our church. We've seen him working in our church over the years, and we've got a new thing coming up. We've got a new pastor and his family coming, and I believe that God wants us to keep moving forward. Through this process, he wanted us to keep moving forward, and God is opening some doors, some new doors. I believe opening new doors to us, to you, to the church. Are we willing to step through those even though we don't know what's on the other side? Let's stand together.